are going on the fence. I mean, that's a shadow of a doubt.
You actually don't believe in evolution anymore?
I don't know. He created a reasonable doubt. He makes you sound like a stupid science bitch.
Yeah, that's good.
Oh my God.
Justice is in many ways the core of all of our social contracts. We not only anticipate, but seemingly require those who have transgressed to be punished for their crimes. It is a central tenet of our social system. And while all people value fairness, we value it to varying degrees, as described by Moral Foundation's theory. But how is justice really enacted in practice, given that it must need be arbitrated and administered by humans with all of our flaws and biases? The United States legal system and legal systems around the world utilize juries so that representative members of the community can collaboratively come to a decision about the guilt or innocence of a defendant. But just how much free will do juries really have over the fate of said defendant? Are juries comprised of individual dissenters arguing for or against certain points based on the true merits of a case? Or are they generally conformist groups that vote in the way that the majority believes, regardless of any rationale for that belief? There will always be court cases that capture the interest of the general public, as the O.J. Simpson trial did in the 1990s, and by nature of that interest, inherently impose some social pressures on jurors who are forced to come to a verdict. But just how influential are the effects of conformity on a group of jurors who specifically have been selected to be impartial? How can a jury possibly be impartial when everyone around them is demanding they make a certain decision, at the threat of violence, at the threat of doxing, at the threat of civil unrest as riots actively break out during that trial and are pretty much guaranteed to continue to occur afterwards, no matter what the result is? How can a jury possibly even be impartial when the case they are hearing has been the impetus of civil unrest for almost a year, and the story has been on every major news network and even has been referenced in popular media? When the city they drive through every day to get to the court is boarding up its shops in anticipation for more civil unrest, when people on the street are open that they will riot if a specific verdict is not reached, when politicians call for confrontation if said verdict is not reached, particularly when the desired verdict is not even an option on the table.
Oh no, not manslaughter. No. This is guilty for murder. I don't know whether it's in the first degree, but as far as I'm concerned, it's first degree.
Congresswoman, what happens if we do not get what you just told? What should the people do? What should protesters on the street do?
I didn't hear you.
What happens?
What should protesters do?
Well, we got to stay on the street, and we've got to get more active. We've got to get more confrontational. We've got to make sure that they know that we mean business.
When a journalist was caught taking photos in the courtroom, and when the media has been so concerned with the identities of the jurors when severed pigs' heads have ended up on the doorsteps of witnesses. How, I ask you, can jurors possibly be impartial? The implication for jurors in the Chauvin case was pretty clear: vote guilty or else. And as such, of course, jurors feel a social pressure to conform. But don't jurors always feel this pressure in highly publicized cases? Particularly when the judge refused to sequester the jury, and thus they are exposed to mounting calls for conformity. How could jurors possibly have voted differently from that which is expected of them at the threat of not just doxing and personal harm, but harm to their communities at large? Whatever your opinion is on the Chauvin case, guilt or innocence, group psychology unquestionably plays a role in the decisions of a jury whose acquiescence is being demanded at knife point. Today, let's look at the research on conformity and acquiescence to the majority, specifically in the case of juries, as well as in general, to understand how juries in major cases, such as the case of Derek Chauvin, which has captured the attention of a nation, are influenced by external and internal social pressures. But let's not focus on that specific case, with all of its controversies and hang-ups, but instead on the psychology of the jury in general. And let's begin by reviewing some of the classic research, as well as some more modern literature, on behavioral and belief conformity. But first, let me tell you about this video's sponsor, me. If you like the content produced on this channel, please consider helping it out by liking, subscribing, and leaving a comment to feed the YouTube algorithm, because it hasn't been favoring me so much recently. Moreover, I've produced some new merch just for today's video that references some of the social psychology experiments that we'll be covering today. There's a recreation of the stimuli used in the Asch conformity experiment, and a simple design with the names of the authors who produced the classic literature on obedience and conformity. I think it's particularly cheeky if you wear a mask that says conform on it, but maybe that's just me. If you want to support the channel and show off some of your nerdiness by rocking a shirt featuring a stimuli from a really old social science study, then consider checking the link down below and buying merch from my merch store. If you're not interested in the designs, but want to help me out anyway, please consider checking out my Patreon or my Subscribestar. Your support is incredibly important to me right now because, as I said, YouTube has been demoting my channel, so if you like this content, please consider joining or getting some merch, and with that, I've shilled enough, so let's get into the social psychology of conformity. So conform by buying my merch. There are several perhaps truly infamous experiments in the social sciences that no matter how much or how little you find yourself to be familiar with the field, you've probably at least heard of. And interestingly, all of them are variations on a theme: conformity. This topic was of great interest to early social psychologists who were trying to figure out why the things that happened in World War II happened. Specifically, the three big studies are Zimbardo's Stanford Prison Experiment, 1971, a study riddled with methodological issues and oft considered in retrospect to have been unethical, wherein Zimbardo assigned one group of students to act as prisoners and another group to act as prison guards, and he was forced to end the experiment early, supposedly because these regular college kids participating in this study began to take their roles a little bit too seriously by conforming to behaviors that they perhaps thought were normative of that role. That is, aggression and even violence on both sides, but particularly on the side of the prison guards. It may surprise you to know, dear viewer, that the infamous Stanford Prison Experiment was in fact given the go-ahead by Stanford's Institutional Review Board, a council of academics who decide whether or not a study involving human participants is ethical. And truly, there is no one thing I think I would rather own on this earth, not a Lambo, not a mansion, than an original copy of the IRB approval of Zimbardo's proposed study.
And finally he says, "Jesus, that's a hell of an act, what do you call it?" And the
Zimbardo
says,
The Stanford Prison Experiment.
The second classic and well-known experiment in this set is the Milgram Obedience Experiment, 1963, wherein subjects were told to ask a series of questions to another person, supposedly another participant but really an actor, in another room, and whenever he answered a question incorrectly, subjects gave an increasingly powerful electric shock to the other person, up to the point where the dial's highest setting was labeled XX. This potentially deadly shock was administered by nearly 2/3 of subjects, being prompted by nothing more than a research assistant dressed in a lab coat asking them to please continue the experiment. Finally, as we're going back in time here in terms of citations, there's the less infamous but just as influential Ash 1951 Conformity Experiment. In this classic piece, subjects were placed into a group of 7 and were presented with an image of one reference line and 3 comparative lines, and then asked to determine which of the 2 lines were equal in length collaboratively with the group. Unbeknownst to the subject, all of the other members in the group were actually research confederates. They were actors or assistants working along with the researcher and in on the purpose of the study. Each time, the confederates insisted that the line lengths were different from whatever the reality was, selecting the wrong 2 lines as equal in length. About 1/3 of participants consistently agreed with the consensus of the group, and essentially agreed with a lie, indicating that a good portion of people will always agree with what others say, even if the claims of the majority are false on their face. That sounds disconcerting on its own, but it becomes more disconcerting when considering that 3/4 of subjects agreed with the group at least one point during the review of these lines, indicating that the majority of people are willing to at least occasionally go along with an obvious falsehood when they are in the minority in a group decision-making process. There is hope in that 1/4 of people will never, ever be swayed by group consensus, at least so long as it applies to something as inconsequential as determining the length of a line. But what about the fate of a man's life? When civic safety and stability hangs in the balance, that's a bit more weighty than the length of a line. But while I'm sure many of you are familiar with these classic experiments, what fewer of you may know is that Ash's own experiment originated from its own line of study. And tracing this line back to its earliest point, we come to a very old study from Sheriff 1935. Sheriff placed subjects into a dark room and projected a light onto the wall, tasking the subjects with determining how much, if at all, the light moved over a period of time. In reality, the light never moved, but we often perceive light as moving when we are surrounded by darkness and have no other frame of reference, a phenomenon known as the autokinetic effect, that you can try out for yourself if you're really bored. Despite this reality that the light was static, subjects generally believed that it had moved between 30 and 80 centimeters during the observation period when watching it alone. Next, subjects were placed into a room with 2 other participants, who had a dissimilar perception of the degree of movement, and were selected specifically because they disagreed, and were again asked to watch the light. He found that the subjects whose perception was vastly dissimilar from the other 2 inevitably conformed to the perception of the other 2 subjects in every single case. Even more potent, perhaps, than the scenario placed upon the subjects in Ash's study, which involved Confederates, Sharif initially found that you do not need to create a false consensus using Confederates for subjects to acquiesce to group conformity. Further, Ash 1956 later sought to further understand if group size played a role in how influential consensus was for conformity, and found that when only 1 Confederate was in the group with the subject, only 3% of people always agreed with the Confederate. When this increased to 2 Confederates, so too did consistent agreement, raised to 13%. Finally, Ash identified the optimal group size for conformity, being 4, such that when there were 3 Confederates, he reproduced his original findings, with 32% of subjects always agreeing with the opinions of said Confederates, despite the fact that they were telling a lie. Maximum group conformity consistently peaks at about 1/3 of subjects, with occasional conformity occurring in 3/4 of participants. There will always be dissent, people who refuse to believe a lie that they can see with their own eyes, just because others insist that the truth is a lie.
No, Rorschach, listen, she may have a dick, but that doesn't mean I like men. I just prefer my women with cocks.
You're a and you like men!
But if we're so prone to go along with the group, what power exactly does dissent actually have, if any at all, in practice, such as in a jury setting? In the classic film 12 Angry Men, an 18-year-old impoverished boy is on trial for the murder of his father, and the judge instructs the jurors that if there is any reasonable doubt of his guilt, they must return a not guilty verdict, lest the young man receive the death penalty, and that they must come to a unanimous agreement. Despite potentially persuasive witness testimony from neighbors, who were not directly present at the scene, the murder weapon, a switchblade which lacks fingerprints and is of common make, 11 of the jurors are immediately convinced well enough to propose a guilty verdict. But for the aforementioned issues, Juror 8 insists there must be reasonable doubt. At first, the other jurors are annoyed by Juror 8's dissent, either finding the evidence to be overwhelming or simply wanting the trial to be over. So Juror 8 suggests a secret ballot from which he will abstain, promising to forward a guilty vote if the rest of the jury is unanimous. Except here's the twist, they're not. A single additional juror votes not guilty. From there, the seeds of reasonable doubt raised by Juror 8 slowly begin to grow in the minds and hearts of the other jurors, who all begin to have their own doubts. It's a great film, and I won't step on the drama, but spoiler for a 60-year-old movie, in the end, the jury votes unanimously not guilty. But while that's a nice story, is it just a story, or can one dissenter actually change the consensus of a group? Well, a year after the film's release, Allen and Levin sought to test the 12 Angry Men hypothesis using a variation of the Ash experiment. But this time, rather than filling the room with Confederates, instructed to intentionally misreport the length of a line, instead, a single Confederate continually dissented against the consensus of the rest of the group of actual participants, with a degree of dissent being manipulated. 5 same-sex subjects and 1 same-sex dissenter Confederate were placed in a room together and shown a series of visual items. For example, which of the numbered arcs was taken out of the circle, general information items, and opinion items.
Would you guys consider jacking off to be a sport? I don't know about you, but I consider that to be a sport, okay?
And were presented with a series of answers that they could choose from, selecting their choice with a switch that lit up and displayed their choice to the other participants, one after another in order, such that the first participant essentially got to set the bar for consensus. The dissenter Confederate, in all but the control condition, wherein he always selected whatever was the most popular choice among the 3 preceding participants, chose an answer dissimilar from the others. Extreme and slight erroneous dissent, that is, when the Confederate chose a clearly wrong answer that was either far off from the previous answer's extreme, or somewhat off from the previous answer's slight, only minimally decreased consensus for information and opinion questions. However, extreme erroneous dissent reduced the consensus on visual questions from 0.75 to 0.35. This could perhaps be because subsequent respondents began to question their own eyesight due to the sheer extremity of the dissent, but I can't say for sure. For all types of questions, however, consensus was reduced to the largest degree when the Confederate answered with veridical dissent. That is, he or she selected the answer that was correct, but not the answer chosen by the previous respondents. Specifically, for visual questions, conformity reduced from 0.75 to 0.24. for information questions from 0.64 to 0.45, and for opinion questions from 1 to 0.44, cutting visual and opinion-based consensus by more than half. Moreover, subjects reported feeling more calm and relaxed when the Confederate gave vertical dissent, perhaps because they suspected that was the correct answer, but felt compelled to comply with the previous answers despite suspecting they were wrong, until the Confederate voted for the correct one, essentially giving the subsequent respondents permission to answer correctly. These data are evidence of the 12 Angry Men phenomenon, in that a single dissenter, particularly and only when that dissenter is reflecting truth, not only creates reasonable doubt in other respondents, but that the mere presence of such a person actually reduces the stress of a decision-based scenario. Even if 7 of the jurors on the jury for the trial of Derek Chauvin just wanted to give him the maximum punishment to avoid all personal harm or harm towards the community, and there will be considerable social pressure to conform and propose that kind of finding regardless of the evidence, as we might expect given the findings of Ashe, if even one juror refuses to acquiesce and instead votes based on evidence and creates reasonable doubt in other jurors, just as with Juror 8 in 12 Angry Men, consensus could be significantly reduced when that dissent is situated in evidence and reality. In 12 Angry Men, Juror 8 brings up real problems with the witness testimony and the murder weapon, rather than issues of feelings or judging the defendant's impoverished and troubled background. And this is perhaps an occasion where life kind of imitates art, in that all one need do is merely speak the truth as a juror, and even if it contradicts with the rest of the jurors, it is persuasive at reducing the tendency towards conformity. This classic study is evidence that you should always stand up for the truth, because even if you're the only one in a room saying it, if it is true, others might believe it, or at least begin to doubt the lies of consensus. Now, you might be saying to yourself at this point, well, Aiden, these studies are all ancient. Clearly, we have evolved since the 1950s as a society, and these findings are no longer relevant. And to that I would say, well, maybe, but generally speaking, human psychology takes a little bit more than a couple of decades for social norms to change radically. If you want an example of how persistent trends in human societies are, just look up how long defenestration was a practice in Prague. Spoiler alert, the most recent one potentially occurred as recently as 2004. But you wouldn't be alone in that criticism, as many scholars have suspected the same possibility. However, it doesn't seem to necessarily be the case. For example, Larson 1974 replicated the initial Ashe experiment 2 decades later, after the swell of anti-conformity seen represented in the civil rights movement, the rise of the hippie, and the Vietnam-era anti-government protests. If there was any period of time in modern US history that could be categorized as generally non-conformist, the late 1960s and early 1970s probably were that period. Therefore, it perhaps should be no surprise that Larson's replication found that compared to the 76.5% of subjects who conformed at least once in Ashe's initial experiment, significantly fewer, 62.5% of subjects acquiesced to conformity at least once in 1974. Given that Ashe only used male participants, Larson initially proposed that his findings could be due to a gendered effect. Thus, we might expect that this decrease could be due to the inclusion of female subjects. But, no, it was actually the opposite of that. 36.4% of men conformed at least once, while 84.6% of women conformed at least once in this replication, indicating perhaps that women are just a little bit more susceptible to group conformity effects than are men.
They ruled the high school, decided what was in, who was popular. It was like the Soviet secret police if they cared a lot about shoes.
Larson ends his brief by suggesting, therefore, that the Ashe study need be periodically replicated, and he did just that another 16 years later in 1990. Do you think Larson found, as he suspected initially, that conformity would increasingly decrease as society advanced? Well, no, because that's not what he found. Instead, he identified the opposite trend, in that while about 87% of women conformed in 1974, in 1990, 92% of women conformed at least once, and while previously 36% of men conformed once, by 1990 this had increased to 50%. Instead, based on their internal research, Larson's 1974 findings were actually aberrant. However, the average tendency for a participant to agree at least once in the line-length experiment across 4 decades of research was 73.5%, pretty much mirroring the initial report from Ashe, even when taking into account the aberrant Larson 1974 findings. In contrast, another replication was conducted by Perrin and Spencer in 1981, again concerned with the possibility the Ashe results were due to the culture of the 1950s, and seemed to find no general evidence for conformity in a sample of British participants. but they did find evidence of the effect in groups wherein there was a power differential and subjects likely felt more compelled to acquiesce. They found results supportive of the Asch experiments present in only 2 of their 3 experiments, one of which placed male students selected due to their status as being on probation in a room with 5 probation officers, and the other which placed West Indian migrants from London in a room with 5 other West Indian Confederates, and a white experimenter, during a time of some racial unrest in the region. In other words, there's some evidence that regular people might not be prone to acquiesce to group conformity, but they may be more susceptible to it when they fear they could be judged or even get in trouble for refusing to conform. In terms of the trial that has the eyes of the nation, surely jurors would have concerns about the potential consequences for not conforming to the majority. So, in summation, the results of the Asch line of study are somewhat consistent, but they're not really naturalistic, are they? They don't really represent reality. After all, in these experiments there were usually some Confederates lying about the length of a line, so perhaps the consistency we see over time is really just a testament to how liars get even better at lying while people become less gullible, right? Well, to test this, Mori and Arai 2010 used no Confederates and instead replicated the original Asch experiment with all subjects by altering the way people in the room perceived the line using sunglasses with different types of polarization. One magenta light passing and the other green light passing, such that a part of the target line was invisible to those wearing the magenta light passing lenses. As with the traditional experiments, one subject was given a pair of sunglasses that were a bit different from the sunglasses of the other 3 subjects, and the group was asked to determine if the 2 lines were equal in length, as usual. Those who wore the different type of polarizing lenses made errors 3 times as often as the majority wearing the other type of lens. Just as with Asch, about a third, specifically, 28.6% of women went along with the majority and agreed with the group's view of the line despite the fact that she saw a different line herself. Men were slightly less susceptible, with their error rate falling at 13.3%. While these findings are far lower than those identified in the Asch experiment and its subsequent replications, there are a number of potential confounds here. Namely that subjects were well aware that they were wearing sunglasses, that despite looking normal could have tipped them off to the possibility that their vision had been altered. Additionally, this study was conducted with entirely Japanese participants, who may culturally have been less likely to argue over their perceptions. Another issue is that simply over time, the general public has become quite well aware of the Asch conformity experiment, so inevitably, as we go forward, it becomes increasingly difficult to directly replicate the study with the same stimuli. It's like loss, people recognize the lines as soon as they see them, and they understand their meaning. As such, it's perhaps imperative we try to turn this research on its head to make sure these effects are still extant in modern society. And a good way of turning something on its head is perhaps to apply a VR headset, which was done in a study from Kirlitsius, Michael Gregorio, 2018. Subjects wore a VR device, assigned a generic male or female avatar reflecting their own sex or gender, and were placed into a digital space with other avatars. There was no indication if these other avatar characters were real people or were computer-controlled AI, much like being on Twitter. And as with previous replications, subjects guessed the length of a line 12 times, while the Confederate avatars intentionally chose incorrectly in 8 out of the 12 trials. Unlike all previous studies, very little conformity was identified here, with 91% of subjects answering correctly regardless of the votes given by the other avatars. This is actually a really neat finding, because it indicates that we can potentially reduce conformity effects by using digital bodies. Of course, a juror's privacy is supposed to be protected to prevent him or her from seeing retribution or harassment, but just the mere presence of another person in a physical space clearly has the capacity to incur conformity over interaction in a more anonymous digital space. A second experiment made the avatars a bit more realistic by syncing voices to mouth movement on the characters, and once again, similar results were forwarded, with 92.3% of subjects answering correctly regarding the length of the line rather than conforming to the inaccurate claims of the group. Interestingly, despite this high degree of accuracy, only 60.7% of respondents said they felt completely confident in their assessment of the line, indicating that while they may have doubted themselves, they were more willing to be adamant towards their own beliefs when using an avatar than other studies on conformity would typically suggest. People are less prone towards conformity when they are de-individuated, when they're anonymous and given a non-identifiable digital body, than they are when they're in a physical space. And gee, I wonder why that might be the case when media representatives are seemingly trying to sneak photos of jurors in the courtroom. The reason we walked down this long Asch conformity line, illustrating that there are seemingly lasting and likely current ramifications for the findings of acquiescence to group consensus, is because it's easy to brush off a paper that's so old as the Ash one. However, the data are fairly consistent, and have remained fairly consistent now for nearly 70 years. And I believe it's time to accept that people will agree with what the majority insists is the truth, particularly in individuated spaces. While dissent casts doubt, ultimately juries are easily influenced by group consensus. 12 Angry Men famously depicts characters becoming irritated at Juror 8 who refuses to comply with the mob, demanding that he agree with the guilty verdict for no reason often other than so they can go home or catch a baseball game. The reality is, the body of research on conformity arising from Ash finds that if 3 or more people tell you that your perception is wrong, there is about a 30% chance that you will agree that your perception is wrong. And that's just in the case of determining the length of a line, not a scenario wherein if you object to the group consensus, there could be riots, your identity could be revealed by media representatives just taking pictures, and your life could be irreparably upturned, to say nothing of the effects on the community, and to say nothing of the fact that moral questions are just more ambiguous than visual ones. If these are the powers of conformity when arguing which line is the same length as another, how do these effects influence moral questions or questions of opinion more complex than determining the length of a line? While review of the history and ongoing implications of Ash illustrate that the conformity phenomenon is likely still present, we are still left with an important question in this line of line-based research. How could group consensus over the length of a line possibly relate to a serious ethical or moral decision with real-world ramifications like a juror decision? After all, there are no stakes in these experiments, and what's being debated in almost all of these studies is an agreement on a factual subject, the length of a line. But we all know that moral questions are not so simple, and while Allen and Levin, 1968, did find that dissent influenced opinion-based questions, what about morality? An early test of the potential influence of conformity and consensus on more subjective questions was conducted by Crutchfield, 1955. In addition to more objective questions, Crutchfield exposed groups of men to moral, ethical, and opinion-based questions along with their responses to these questions from other men in the group via a panel placed in front of them. However, every man in the group was fed a false consensus on the panel, really controlled by the researchers. These questions pertain to personal values such as, quote, free speech being a privilege rather than a right, it is proper for a society to suspend free speech whenever itself is threatened. When responding alone, only 19% of participants agreed with that statement, but 58% agreed when confronted by a unanimous group who endorsed it. Only a few men agreed with the statement that, quote, I believe we are made better by the trials and hardships of life on their own, but 38% agreed with that statement when they believed others in the group did. Similarly, not a single participant said that he doubted his capacity as a leader, but when there was a perception of consensus, 37% of men reported agreement. For more societal level issues, when asked what the biggest problem facing America was today, and recall this is 1955, only 12% of men chose subversive activities over economic recession, educational facilities, mental health, or crime and corruption. But when they believed that the group chose subversive activities as the greatest threat to the country, this percentage increased to 48%. The only matter of opinion that was seemingly immune to the effects of conformity was preference for art, in that there was no change in which drawing the participants said that he preferred, regardless of the presence of group consensus. Proof that I guess there's no arguing artistic taste.
Bullshit. Bullshit. Derivative. That I love. I absolutely love.
Crutchfield further found that all of these effects were heightened when the researcher announced that the group consensus answer was the correct answer after the first question, indicating that the influence is not just of group consensus, but of authority on conformity. Much as with the questions raised by critics of the Ash study, we have to immediately raise the same question for this old study. Does any of this have any bearing on modern morality? After all, there's this perception that we've evolved as a culture and society since the 1950s. And I mean, subversive activities in 1955 referred to someone being a commie-sympathizing pinko. But today, conservatives are supposedly colluding with the Russians and communism is fashionable. So we can assume, I'd say with some certainty, that we'd get somewhat different results when asking a panel of subjects today which of these things they think is the greatest threat to America. but it's worth looking at Crutchfield's finding to give us a baseline with which to compare contemporary data. For example, Aramovich and Skitka, 2012, sought to investigate how apparent group consensus might influence the moral perceptions of torture. Subjects first gave their personal opinions on torture via a Likert-type instrument, and were then told they would discuss the topic of torture via a computer with others. Participants were told they would get to give their opinion in a random order. However, the subject always found himself or herself going last. After all the other supposed participants had given their own opinions, subjects chose how supportive he or she was of torture as a strategy. They found that the degree of support or opposition towards torture that participants expressed before the group activity tended to differ from the opinions expressed with the group. Specifically, for groups wherein there was a consensus that torture was justified, 80% of participants reported less opposition to torture than they previously had in private, while 17% maintained their initial position, and only 2% reported stronger opposition than previously reported, perhaps indicative of psychological reactance, the kind of you can't tell me what to do effect of psychology. Of course, when we're being pressured by a group and being asked to give our opinion in front of others, that can be potentially intimidating. But Aramovich and Skitka found these effects both when subjects were asked to report on their opinion towards torture publicly and privately. There was a correlation of 0.91 between public opinions and private ones. That is, 80% of participants were less opposed to torture after exposure to a group of alleged peers who supported torture, and conformity towards the group consensus opinion persisted even after they were given an opportunity to report on their attitude privately after the fact. To understand more, we can look to Kundu and Cummins, 2013, who applied the Asch conformity experiment to other moral questions. Participants were presented with a series of moral dilemmas in the form of short vignettes. These vignettes differed in that some involved the use of personal force, and some were either an unintentional side effect or the result of the intentional actions of a person within the scenario. For example, an unintentional scenario without personal force is the trolley problem, and I don't mean the Australians, which asks subjects if it is moral to switch the lever and change the track of a runaway trolley to save 5 lives at the cost of 1 life, while a scenario with an intended effect and personal force is the crying baby problem, which asks the subject if it is moral to suffocate a crying child to prevent a group of people hiding from enemy soldiers from being located. Subjects were placed in a room with Confederates and asked to state aloud if the actions of the protagonists in these scenarios were morally permissible or impermissible in order, beginning with the Confederates and ending with the experimental subject. They found that when Confederates judged highly impermissible moral transgressions as permissible, participants also rated them as permissible. That is, when others said it was morally acceptable to suffocate a crying child, subjects were more likely than the control group to also agree that it was morally acceptable. In contrast, vignettes that were typically judged as permissible were found to be significantly less so under dissenting social pressure, such that when consensus determined it was immoral to save 5 people at the cost of 1 life in the trolley problem, subjects were more likely to agree that it was immoral to save 5 lives at the cost of 1. These results are indicative that people are willing to make moral choices that they otherwise would not agree with when they feel that they are in the minority in their moral perceptions. Since I mentioned the trolley problem, it's a particularly interesting ethical conundrum to consider because it places deontological concerns with personal principles at odds with consequentialist concerns. That is, by pulling the lever in the trolley problem, you have intervened and essentially caused the death of a single person. Under deontological ethics, the intention matters over the consequence, while under consequentialist ethics, as the name implies, consequence matters over intent. The choice of whether to vote guilty or not guilty out of principle, or out of concern for potential unintended ramifications of that vote on others, on a city, on a country, would be perhaps a good example, and relevant one, of deontological versus consequentialist ethics. To study how group obedience and social pressure might affect answers to the classic trolley problem, Boston and Rhodes, 2017, presented subjects with the trolley problem on a computer, and before selecting their answer, were shown a supposed percentage breakdown of how previous respondents had answered the question, manipulated to indicate consensus. Their first sample took the test on a computer in the lab, and the other sample took the test online, potentially at home. Participants in the lab, when the majority supported the consequentialist outcome, that is, flipping the lever to save 5 people, were more likely to also choose to save 5 people rather than to save 1, and were less likely to choose the consequentialist outcome when the majority preferred the deontological one, choosing not to flip the lever. Specifically, lab participants were 1.6 times more likely to choose the consequentialist outcome when the group favored consequentialism than when they preferred the deontological outcome. Consequentialist answers were 1.3 times more common when the group majority supported consequentialism, and consequentialist answers were similarly 1.46 times less common when the group favored the deontological answer. When subjects took the test outside of the lab, far away from the other supposed participants who might be judging their opinions, since again they were led to believe their answers could affect the percentages shown on the screens of others, these effects were diminished. Outside of the lab, subjects were 1.3 times more likely to choose the consequentialist answer when the group chose the consequentialist answer as well, than the consequentialist answer when the group chose the deontological answer. It seems then that when people are more anonymous, as we mentioned before, they are potentially less susceptible to conformity effects. But in a more face-to-face setting, perceptions of group consensus can alter the choices of what one finds to be morally acceptable by 65%, or at least when the moral question involves trains. So it seems that juries, voting in person, are inherently less susceptible to group consensus effects than are people communicating in more online, anonymous environments who likely feel less group pressure to acquiesce to the majority. However, even online, social conformity effects persist, as seen in a study from Kelly et al. 2017, which presented subjects with a computer-based test involving moral questions and depicted supposedly typical responses from other users. The quandaries subjects read presented either threats to the moral foundation of purity or the foundation of harm or care. Briefly, what Haidt's moral foundations theory posits is that we all have the same values, but some of us hold those values as more sacred than others. The purity foundation describes the disgust felt towards filthy acts or things.
Hey, what is this?
It's my mom's recipe.
Hey, what is this?
While harm/care describes the desire to protect others from abuse. In this study, the purity question involved a family whose pet dog was hit by a car and then decided to eat the dog. Oof. While the harm/care question involved a group of passengers on a sinking ship choosing to throw a large passenger off of their life raft to ensure that more passengers would survive. Subjects believed both scenarios were more condemnable when they had been led to believe that the majority of people also found the scenario to be condemnable, while the opposite was so, albeit to a smaller degree, when they were led to believe that others found the scenario to be morally acceptable behavior. In a second experiment, subjects were presented with the same scenarios and the same ratings from others who found said scenario either as morally acceptable or condemnable, but this time they were also shown reasonings given by others to explain their choice, which were either rational or emotional. For example, a rational and acceptable reasoning for eating the dog would be that the dog was already dead, while an emotional and acceptable reasoning emphasized the poverty a family must experience to even consider eating their family pet. In contrast, rational and condemnable reasoning stated that the dog should have been treated with respect, while a condemnable and emotional response, the reaction I'm sure most of us have, described the disgusting nature of such an action. The researchers found that rational arguments were more persuasive in moving the opinions of subjects than were emotional arguments, but that rational arguments were particularly potent in increasing the rating of acceptability rather than condemnation. Thus, even though anonymity provides some minor bulwark against the effects of social conformity, we still fall victim to group consensus even online, even when anonymous. Moreover, when justifications and arguments are made for the justness of an action, as is often the case when jurors discuss how to cast a vote in a court case, said arguments, when combined with the perceived consensus, can significantly alter how acceptable one might find an otherwise reprehensible act. Specifically, in the first study, when only consensus information was available, subjects found the story about eating the dog more acceptable at a level of 0.5, comparatively to baseline measures of acceptability. However, when given a logical rationale, this increased to more than 1.5 more acceptability than the baseline, an increase of more than 3 times increased acceptability compared to a vacuum. Since that dog example is fairly extreme, as are variations upon the trolley question, we should look at some less abstract and more mundane moral questions in relationship to the effects of group conformity, which was studied relatively recently by Cornwell Yago and Higgins 2019. Subjects were placed in a room with 4 Confederates, first answering a questionnaire which included their rating of their personal feelings of power, and after completion, were instructed to read descriptions of 10 behaviors, taking turns with the Confederates and then reporting publicly on whether they found the behaviors to be morally acceptable or unacceptable. These scenarios had previously been rated as generally acceptable or unacceptable by a pre-test group, and included murder, unacceptable, telling your friend she doesn't look fat in her jeans, acceptable, exposing a friend's secret out of jealousy, unacceptable, or a man choosing to save the life of his son instead of a hitchhiker after a car accident, acceptable. So a mix of more serious and less serious issues. The Confederates in each trial either always responded with a moral judgment deemed as non-standard or standard by the pretest. After each question, subjects wrote down whether or not they agreed with the group of Confederates, and wrote about their general feelings after completing all 10 trials. When the Confederates voiced opinions that were atypical and went against what was normally seen as morally permissible or impermissible, for example, saying it's okay to tell your friend, in fact, yes, she does look fat in those jeans, then subjects were significantly more likely to agree with the moral judgment that they would otherwise likely disagree with, to a degree ranging from an increase in agreement between 30 and 55%. The smallest degree of agreement with the group's unusual moral judgment involved a question wherein the Confederates said it was morally wrong for a guy to watch a horror movie rather than a romantic movie after a breakup, while the fat jeans question and a question wherein Confederates reported it was morally unacceptable to give a drunk homeless man $5 saw the greatest effect sizes. Group influence was lower in cases with less ambiguous stimuli. That is, when the moral answer is more clear-cut, such as in the case of a murder, rather than in cases wherein it was more up for debate, like mentioning to your friend that she's a bit too thick for her jeans. Moreover, people who felt more powerful were less likely to go along with the consensus. These data are all indicative that even more complex subjective moral decisions are subject to the same effects of group conformity, just as are simple and objective questions like determining the length of a line. On the positive side of things, though, people who see themselves as more powerful or agentic are less susceptible to the effects of social conformity. But of perhaps unique concern when it comes to juries, now maybe more than ever, is the issue of political orientation, and that political beliefs could cloud or influence the way that jurors decide to vote. Thus, we should understand how political beliefs interact with social conformity effects, and we can do that by looking at a doctoral dissertation from Langford 2020. Dr. Langford sought to understand the relationship between political manichaeism, aka political prejudice, and influence from seeming group consensus. After answering a questionnaire about their own beliefs, subjects responded to 2 scenarios. The first morally ambiguous dilemma indicated that most conservatives tended to rate the scenario as morally unacceptable, and liberals tended to rate the scenario as morally acceptable. The second ambiguous and third unambiguous moral dilemma indicated that most liberals tended to rate the scenarios as morally unacceptable, and conservatives tended to rate the scenarios as morally acceptable. The ambiguous scenario conservatives allegedly agreed with was the right to kill one's child to save your spouse and 3 other children. The ambiguous scenario liberals allegedly agreed with was the right to break a terrorist's son's arm to prevent him from harming others. And the ambiguous scenario liberals allegedly agreed with was killing a man's father to obtain his money for yourself and his son. Participants only conformed with the supposed beliefs of their political in-group when the moral dilemma was ambiguous. Specifically, participants who self-identified as conservatives agreed with the ambiguous moral dilemmas, more in line with the fabricated conservative opinion. Participants who self-identified as liberal agreed with the ambiguous moral dilemmas, more in line with fabricated liberal opinions, and participants who identified themselves as moderate, fence-sitting centrists rated all dilemmas somewhere in between. In the unambiguous morality condition, political ideology played little role in how participants judged the acceptability of the scenario. That is, anti-liberal participants rated the third dilemma significantly different from anti-conservative participants and neutral participants. As such, yes, our political ideology and the perceptions of the opinions of those who share our ideology may influence our perceptions of the morality of more ambiguous scenarios. However, politics plays a smaller role, if any at all, in unambiguously immoral scenarios. When the situation is not so clear-cut, however, social conformity would predict that we would be more likely to agree with whatever moral choice we believe is typical for those who share our political beliefs. Of the jurors on the Chauvin case, 2 stated that they had somewhat favorable views of Black Lives Matter, and 2 said they were very supportive of it. Knowing that it only takes really 1 or 2 people to begin to sway or swing a jury, and knowing that politics will inherently play a role in this case, if the jurors think that those who agree with them politically believe that Chauvin is guilty, or vice versa, in addition to all of the social pressures inherently present in a jury, then conformity will be more likely, if not inevitable. Knowing now that the effects of social conformity in group decision scenarios extend beyond just determining the length of a line and into morality, we have a pretty good research-based rationale to suspect that juries are susceptible perhaps uniquely to group influence, particularly when there are politics at play, and when not just truth, but perhaps more importantly, socialization is involved. After all, humans are an inherently social species and will always be influenced by our peers to a degree, but seemingly uniquely when it comes to forming group consensus. But so far we've looked exclusively at theory, and I'm sure some of you must be saying, well, sure, that's how this all works in a laboratory without any stakes, but what does that have to do with a courtroom? And for that reason, let's head out of the theoretical frying pan and into the very real fires of reality. Do the effects of conformity in the lab apply to the jury? Let's first review some more old research on how juries tend to work, since we're getting into practice here, just to get a grasp of the nature of juries as social groups. Zeisel 1971 somewhat corroborated the findings of Ash in that he found that it is not the proportion of a jury that dissents, but rather the mere number of members that plays a role in changing the opinions of a mock jury. Jurors in this study listened to either a highly incriminating or mildly incriminating version of a case. While the 6-person juries in the highly incriminating condition voted mostly guilty, larger juries reported more hung jurors, those unwilling to proffer a vote. Deliberation in larger groups also took more time, thus even when the evidence is highly incriminating, more people slow down the process, likely due to dissent or perhaps the 12 Angry Men effect, of one or a few jurors creating reasonable doubt in others. As such, while larger juries are slower to act, they may be slightly less susceptible to group conformity effects. Further, Kerr, Atkins, Stracer, Meek, Holt, and Davis, 1976, found that juries have a greater tendency to become hung when forced to come to a unanimous decision rather than a majority decision. This may be a manifestation of social loafing, or a desire to not be seen as morally responsible for making an error in casting one's vote. Thus, smaller juries are more likely to reach easy consensus, while larger juries struggle to reach unanimity. Just some general findings to keep in mind. What we really need to figure out here, though, is this. Is the hypothesis proposed by 12 Angry Men actually real? Can 1 or 2 people sway the opinions of a jury that's already made up its mind? Schade, Sunstein, and Hastie, 2007, brought together groups of people from 2 Colorado cities, Boulder and Colorado Springs, the former being a more liberal city and the latter a more conservative one, to discuss global warming, affirmative action, and civil unions for same-sex couples in a jury-like setting. They found that whatever opinion the participants had before the discussion began was only amplified over the course of the debate. Liberals became more liberal in their beliefs and conservatives more conservative. Outliers within the group who diverged significantly from either majority were never able to make much progress in attempts to convince their fellow jurors, and instead were more likely to become converts rather than converters, very much unlike Juror 8 in 12 Angry Men. Within groups of people who have already agreed with one another, division only increased with continued conversation. That is, partisans are going to remain partisans, and only actually become more partisan upon deliberation, and rather than a figure devoted to truth being able to influence the beliefs of the majority or majorities, those arguing from a third position will be subsumed into one group or another, and forced to acquiesce. One single person in a jury is unlikely to enact change, and this is a problem of group polarization, as we can see just how frequently jurors go against their own beliefs to conform to the majority in research from Waters and Hans, 2009. Nearly 3,500 former jurors who served on felony cases across the US were asked if they had capitulated with the majority on the jury, and if the decision was left solely up to him or her, if he or she would have voted differently. Most jurors said they came to agree either with conviction or acquittal, and were more likely to be hung, all based on the prosecution's evidence rather than that of the defense, indicating that the prosecution is kind of more important in either direction than the defense is. Similar to data we'll see more of later, whatever the initial opinion was of the jury before deliberation was also likely to be the outcome of the jury ultimately, with 89% of juries wherein the majority began with the intent to vote guilty, ultimately voting guilty, and 87% wherein the majority intended to acquit, acquitting, while in instances where the jury was initially split, 80% produced some verdict rather than remaining hung. In 54% of juries, at least one person dissented from the majority opinion, yet outcomes illustrate that dissent is minor in its effects on verdicts, and whether the jury acquitted or convicted, typically the most common number of dissenting figures on a jury was one person. During deliberation is when most jurors said that they held out against the majority, hung the jury, or acquiesced to the majority. There were differences between guilt and acquittal verdicts, in that of the jurors who said their personal verdict was acquittal, but the jury's majority favored conviction, 35% ultimately hung the jury. In contrast, jurors who said their personal verdict was a conviction, but the jury favored acquittal, only 12.5% hung the jury. One thing that's a bit disconcerting in these data is that one of the things jurors said they generally didn't care much about was the actual fate of the defendant. Thus, it's possible that whatever happens in deliberation is more about social conformity than it is about the guilt or innocence of another person, and making sure that justice is served.
Have we become so fearful? Have we become so cowardly that we must extinguish a man because he carries the blood of a current enemy?
Conforming dissenters, those who disagreed during deliberation but still ultimately decided to vote with the majority, also tended to be people most willing to change their minds, with only 17% saying they never changed their opinion during the course of the trial, while 45% of those in the majority and 43% of holdouts never changed their opinion. Jurors who acquiesced to the majority without dissent were more likely to say that the jury did not use secret ballots, 37%, compared to conforming dissenters, 47%, and holdouts, 53%. Moreover, more than 40% of conforming dissenters changed their minds compared to only about 25% of all other jurors. Majority voters were also very sure of themselves, being more likely than holdouts and conforming dissenters to say that all relevant evidence was presented, that the evidence and experts were easy to understand, that the prosecution and police were believable, that they were satisfied with the results, and that the prosecution had a strong case. In turn, holdouts and conforming dissenters, compared to the majority, were more surprised by the other jurors' opinions, viewed the jury as less open-minded, participated in more deliberation but viewed their contributions as less influential, viewed one or two jurors as dominating the discussion, and believed all jurors were not listened to equally, perceived more conflict on the jury, believed they did not have much time to express their views, felt that there was more time spent trying to convince jurors to conform, were less satisfied with the deliberations, and found voting more difficult. Additionally, holdouts and conforming dissenters, compared to the majority, viewed the trial as less fair, came to an incorrect outcome, and were less trustworthy of the police and courts in general. Much like with Juror 8, dissenters who favored acquittal also favored secret ballots, found the case more difficult to decide, found understanding expert advice to be somewhat more simple, and were less likely to view the outcome of the conviction as fair in comparison to those who favored conviction. Ultimately, the results of this study, of which there are many, and if it feels like I've gone on about it a bit too long, trust me, I'm just covering the big hits, are this. Over 1/3 of jurors intimated to researchers privately that they would have voted against the jury's decision, but felt compelled to comply during the vote. Almost identical findings to that of Ash. Thus, not only do juries enter deliberation already knowing how they intend to vote, and are unlikely to move from that opinion, but even of dissenters, more than 1/3 will still acquiesce to the majority rather than stand and fight for what they believe in. For the evidence is indicative that even if they did, they would likely be unable to change the opinion of the majority. When the jury member is not just facing being in the minority, but the very real possibility that dissent will cause riots and violence, would this effect not be heightened? A master's thesis from Bowser 2013 somewhat contradicts the overwhelming influence of initial belief versus belief after deliberation in juries. Subjects read a brief about a murder trial and gave their initial opinions on the guilt of the defendant in writing, as well as their certainty of that verdict. They then met in groups of 5 or 6 to deliberate on their decision and filled out a similar form post-deliberation indicating their verdict. Confidence in the verdict increased, with 57% being modestly certain before deliberation to 57% being very certain afterwards. Despite the increase in certainty, 58% of subjects said they changed their opinion at some point during deliberation. A similar 56% of subjects reported that deliberation was influential on their decision, and 70% said that deliberation made the choice of guilt or innocence easier. Thus, yes, people are absolutely capable of changing their minds and their decisions during deliberation in a trial, even if they predominantly do tend to stick with whatever belief they came into the deliberation holding. Another potentially important factor for juries is just how many arguments they hear from each side, and while jurors are supposed to be impartial, it's always difficult to find unbiased jurors when dealing with cases that have high degrees of public notoriety, and as such, most jurors have often heard all of the arguments for or against a case before even entering the courtroom. Given that 5 of the 12 jurors on the Chauvin case expressed going in that they had a somewhat negative opinion of Chauvin, the reality is jurors know how they intend to vote long before they enter deliberation. And there is research which is indicative that just the sheer number of arguments heard can affect jurors, as seen in Calder, Insko, and Yadel, 1974. Participants in a mock jury heard a series of arguments from the defense or the prosecution in a randomized order, and their perceptions of the guilt or innocence of the defendant was rated as the case proceeded. When subjects heard 7 arguments from the defense and 1 argument from the prosecution, the average rating of guilt was 3, while when subjects heard 7 arguments from the prosecution and 1 from the defense, the average rating of guilt was over twice as high, coming in at 6.2. This is just evidence that outside of the potential effects of conformity, when we hear one argument more than another, or one side more than another, in a jury situation, we are more likely to believe the arguments we have just heard more of. I know that sounds like a no-duh effect, but when you consider how media coverage can influence a case, any case, then it seems likely the sheer amount of arguments one hears, potentially outside of the courtroom as well as inside it, can be influential. Thus, if people hear nothing but the narrative that the defendant is guilty outside of the courtroom, well, how do you think that's going to affect the jury? Moreover, some data are evidence that we can't really train these kinds of biases out of a jury. For example, the court in New Jersey versus Henderson created judicial instructions designed to educate jurors about potential for eyewitnesses to be inaccurate and to make jurors more aware of the various factors that impact eyewitness accuracy, something that's become known as the Henderson instructions. But does instructing the jury in potential issues of bias and eyewitness accuracy actually have the effect of jurors being more stringent in their analysis of testimony? Well, let's look to Burgle et al. 2020 for some answers. Subjects watched a recording of a trial wherein a woman had been assaulted, and her testimony as to the identity of the perpetrator was key to the case. Participants wrote down their initial impressions of the defendant's guilt, and then were broken down into deliberation groups of 5 to 9 people and asked to discuss the case. Before deliberation began, the researchers gave subjects either a handout that defined reasonable doubt, or a handout that defined both reasonable doubt and the Henderson instructions, and in both conditions, subjects were asked to reach a unanimous verdict. The quality of eyewitness testimony was manipulated, such that in the poor estimator condition, she did not identify the assailant for a month, he had been holding a weapon, which understandably distracts the victim from paying attention to other aspects of the crime, and only saw his face for a few seconds, while in the good estimator condition, she identified the assailant the next day, he had no weapon, and she saw his face for a good 45 seconds. Additionally, system variables were manipulated, such that in the poor system condition, the police provided the victim with a one-person show-up, incorrectly did not say that the man may or may not be the perpetrator, and gave positive feedback that she had correctly identified the assailant. While in the good system condition, there was a 6-person lineup. The victim was instructed that the perpetrator may not be present, and she received no post hoc feedback from the officers. So even with all of that reasonable doubt, and when provided with the Henderson instructions that train juries specifically in the potential inaccuracies of eyewitness testimony, was the jury more accurate? No, they weren't. In fact, they were even worse. Generally, the Henderson instructions seemingly had the opposite of the intended effect on the guilty verdict, with more guilty verdicts when jurors had been made aware of issues with eyewitness testimony. Additionally, the researchers found evidence in the opposite of their hypothesized direction for estimator quality. That is, even when given the Henderson instructions, jurors were more likely to unanimously give a guilty verdict when the assailant had a weapon and when the victim only saw his face for a few seconds and took a month to identify him. Individual jurors were actually less likely to privately write down that they believed the defendant was not guilty when given the Henderson instructions. But that ultimately didn't end up affecting the jury's decision. And much as with the jury as a whole, individual jurors were more likely to vote guilty when estimator quality was poor. This is indicative that juries are more prone to believe eyewitnesses who are less accurate in their account, and specifically after having been told about problems with eyewitness testimony. Instead, juries were slightly less likely to render a guilty verdict when the issues lay in system variables. That is, when the cops messed up in presenting the lineup to the victim, guilty verdicts were less common. This was the case despite the fact that jurors were far more likely to recall the presence of a weapon and the time delay in the poor quality testimony during deliberation. The general findings of this study are frankly a little bit scary when it comes to the implications for the legal system, in that while people are sensitive to issues with procedure potentially affecting the quality of testimony, they are seemingly easily swayed by the emotions of an eyewitness. There was no additional information collected to help understand why jurors didn't vote significantly less guilty based on poorer evidence, despite instructions to be vigilant. But my guess would be that that was precisely because the poor testimony kind of just sounds more emotional. The victim took a long time to process the event, had been threatened with a deadly weapon, and only caught a brief glimpse of her assaulter's face, but surely a glimpse that would be burned into her memory, right? The other victim's account of immediately identifying the perpetrator, not having been threatened with a weapon, and getting a good long look at his face sounds comparatively kind of clinical. Moreover, even though jurors individually expressed doubts and issues with the testimony, they still voted guilty based on bad evidence when acting as a group. I brought up my hypothesis as a possibility because jurors often tend to fill in the blanks in their own heads with information that's not explicitly present in a case to essentially help flesh out the scene in their own heads, and we can see that in a review from Pennington and Hastie 1990. As evidenced in a series of studies from this cohort, individuals from a mock jury heard the same story and the same evidence, and yet developed distinct narratives to explain to themselves what had happened. For example, one member of the jury thought that the defendant was angry after a quarrel with the deceased, went home to get a knife with which he planned to kill the victim, and then carried the act out in a rage, while another juror from the same group who heard the exact same evidence thought the defendant was scared after a quarrel with the deceased, went home to get a knife with which to defend himself, and then killed the deceased in self-defense. Generally speaking, they found jurors only ever considered one possible narrative at one time, and these findings illustrate how two people in the exact same room can hear the exact same story and fill in the blanks in a completely different way, like a game of Mad Libs but with people's real lives on the line. Another study in this line similarly found that when some jurors were unable to align a verdict with the story that they had concocted in their own heads, they voted not guilty simply because the evidence didn't align with their own perception of what had happened. Perhaps because jurors tend to view evidence presented in a case as a type of story, additional research from this cohort found that when subjects heard evidence presented in a story-like sequential order, rather than the more typical witness examination cross-examination, they were more likely to either vote guilty or not guilty, depending on whether the prosecution, 78% guilty, or the defense, 31% guilty, was presented in a narrative format. In other words, jurors want to hear a story rather than evidence.
Hold it!
In terms of the potential for conformity to influence juries, Hastie examined the content during the deliberation process and found that initially, jurors tended to basically just relay their own perceptions of the events, at which point the discussion can become pretty heated due to the fact that, as mentioned, jurors construct different versions of the story within their own minds. However, Hastie also noted that consistently, opinions of jurors were most likely to change when discussion turned toward the instructions of the judge, such that an emphasis on reasonable doubt, much as is depicted in the fictitious 12 Angry Men. Conversations about testimony and evidence were far less likely to precede opinion change, in contrast. Hastie suggests that this is because jurors tend to all be fairly certain that his or her interpretation of the facts in a case are accurate, but also tend to be unfamiliar with the letter of the law or court procedure, and thus, when reference to the judge's instructions are broached as a topic, jurors may change their opinions on a verdict without necessarily being forced to change their perception of events. Moreover, and to really hammer home some of the issues with juries, Pennington and Hastie reference Chauvin and Zeisel 1966, who found in their research that whatever decision the majority of the jury generally favored at the beginning of deliberation would be the decision that that jury eventually reached 90% of the time, which means just as with Ash and the conformity research, without a few really strong dissenters, even if all of the jurors have completely different perceptions of a case, changing the mind of a jury is unlikely, and instead most have made up their minds before they enter deliberation. This tendency was also studied by Davis 1973, who, using mock juries, found that when 2/3 or more of the jury favored a particular verdict at the start of deliberation, there was a near 100% chance that the entire jury would eventually agree with whatever the perception of the majority was, and in contrast, mock juries without an initial 2/3 majority tended to acquit in general. Later, Sandys and Dillahay 1995 isolated similar results, in that the verdict preferred by the majority of jurors on the first ballot ended up being the jury's final verdict in between 89% and 93% of trials. This all seems to indicate, as we might hope, that when a jury has reasonable doubt and cannot come to a guilty verdict unanimously, they tend to acquit rather than acquiesce to a guilty verdict. However, the opposite is also the case, in that when jurors believe the defendant is guilty even before hearing evidence, they will almost always vote to convict. This tendency was also identified in a meta-analysis of cases from McCune and Kerr 1988, who found that pro-conviction majorities prevailed 67% of the time, while pro-acquittal majorities succeeded an overwhelming of 94% of the time. Further, with regard to a potential leniency bias towards the defendant, 81% of evenly divided juries acquitted. However, Sandy and Dillahay found, to the contrary, that when a jury was initially evenly split, there was a 71% possibility that the jury would ultimately vote to convict. So, seems like jurors have pretty much made up their minds before deliberation, before even hearing evidence. So do juries tend towards leniency or towards rigor? To find some answers to this question, Devine et al. 2004 questioned entire juries as well as some lawyers and judges after trials to get a better idea as to the thought process of participants in the justice system. Much as with prior data, they found there was an initial 83% agreement between jurors upon initial deliberation, and more specifically, that the percentage of juries that ended up making a decision counter to that proffered by the majority at step 1, rather than being hung, was only 5%. There was very little difference between juries that favored either acquittal or guilt, in that 94% of juries wherein the majority began from a position favoring acquittal ended up acquitting, while 90% of juries wherein the majority began from a position favoring guilt ended up forwarding a guilty verdict. The big differences appeared when looking at close juries, in that close juries ended up convicting 75% of the time, which is evidence that when a jury is conflicted, they tend towards conviction, not towards leniency. The total result of this analysis, when regressed, indicated that based on these data, one could predict the outcome of a trial based on the initial opinions of jurors with 90% accuracy. I bring this all up because when the media has primed people with so much exposure to a trial or a case, then of course, it's more likely for jurors to have made up their minds before even seeing the evidence, let alone before entering deliberation. In persuasion research, there are two general memory effects that can influence how we recall information: the primacy effect and the recency effect. The primacy effect predicts that we tend to recall information that we've heard first, while the recency effect predicts we tend to recall information we saw more recently. These effects were studied, though, in classic research from Crano 1977. Subjects in this experiment read two fact-based articles in random order, one which was in favor of Medicare and the other opposed, and their attitudes and retention of information presented was measured a week later, and found that participants were more likely to agree with the attitude of the article that they had read most recently, rather than first. Furnham 1986 examined the recency effect specifically in a legal context by tasking subjects to listen to an argument from a trial that appeared in different orders and percentages. First, both groups heard 2 arguments from the prosecution and then 4 from the defense. Then one group heard 3 arguments from the prosecution first, and next 3 arguments from the defense, while group 3 heard 3 arguments from the defense and then 3 from the prosecution. In other words, in the opposite order. Consistently, across multiple samples, they found that participants viewed the defendant as more guilty when arguments from the prosecution occurred last, while participants viewed the defendant as less guilty when they heard arguments from the defense last. A slightly more recent study from Carlson and Russo in 2001 similarly found scant evidence for the primacy effect, but consistent evidence for the recency effect on jurors in a mock trial of a civil case. Somewhat conflicting evidence that amounts to about the same kind of outcome from Stone 1969 found that the order in which information was presented to a jury had no effect on the outcome of the case, although it might appear to based on the raw data, but instead that the initial opinion of jurors, as we've seen, did affect the outcome. Moreover, 2/3 of jurors who temporarily reported changes in their opinion during the trial returned to their initial opinion when determining the verdict. That is, information order was less influential to persuasion on the jury than were initial opinions of jurors upon initial deliberation. Thus, we've seen evidence that the majority opinion of the jury before discussion or before evidence is even presented predicts the eventual decision of said jury. And all of this appears to be completely uninfluenced by the actual evidence. As depressing as it may sound, jurors basically know how they're going to vote before they enter the courthouse, and are very unlikely to change their opinions unless they happen to be in the minority of opinion, and then they change only to acquiesce to the majority. Remember, nearly half of all jurors in the Chauvin case began deliberation stating they believed he was guilty. And on that less than positive note, let's come to a few conclusions. Over the course of this long video, we've seen how group conformity can affect how long we report the length of a line to be, which, although simple, could have some long-reaching implications, and that these effects have remained pretty stable over time, even though they may not affect all people equally, and some people may be outright immune to this effect. We also saw how the effects of group conformity extend beyond just determining how long a line is and into far more serious concerns of morality and ethics. Finally, we saw how juries go into their task generally already knowing how they intend to vote, and how the majority on a jury at the start, at step 1, generally gets to decide how that jury will eventually vote, with dissenters having very little capacity to change the course of a trial. While 12 Angry Men has taught us as a society that a single person who is concerned with following the letter of the law can turn the tide of a decision, the reality is rarely as nice as fiction. And the reality is this: however the majority of jury members have decided that they're going to vote long before deliberation, hell, likely long before the trial itself, based on their own preconceptions and not so much based on evidence presented at the trial, is how the jury will vote about 90% of the time. If that seems like a miscarriage of justice, maybe it is, but it's also an unfortunate reality of the human condition. We will always be prone to group psychology effects and social pressure, be it within the courtroom or without. It's also pretty much impossible to find jurors who know nothing about major cases and therefore haven't been influenced by arguments before being called to serve. This video is in no way meant to be a condemnation of juries as a construct, but rather meant to just illustrate to you, dear viewer, why juries sometimes vote the way that they do. Not always because of evidence, but because of social conformity. And finally, in the case of the Chauvin trial, again, whatever your personal opinion is on his guilt or innocence, I personally think there was a good argument for manslaughter. If the jury thought, and they had a good reason to think it, having not been sequestered and likely hearing the sentiments of people like Maxine Waters, that bad things would happen if they did not find him guilty on all counts, well, that's pretty good evidence that the verdict was strongly influenced by social conformity effects, just as much as a desire to protect themselves and their community. However, if the jurors were under the impression that voting guilty on all verdicts would ameliorate the tensions, well, just listen to the words of people and politicians upon getting the result that society, if not the law, demanded.
A measure of justice isn't the same as equal justice. This verdict brings us a step closer, and the fact is, we still have work to do.
I would not call today's verdict justice, however, because justice implies true restoration.
It's not justice. And I'll explain to you why it's not justice. It's not justice because justice is George Floyd going home tonight to be with his family.
We're never going to be satisfied. Black Lives Matter isn't a trend, it's a movement.
And if you thought that this verdict meant there wouldn't be riots, well, there are already riots. It seems to me that acquiescence, no matter how tempting and how prone we are inherently towards it as human beings, only sets a bad precedent for the legal system going forward. But hey, what do you guys think? Do you think that juries are generally better at determining guilt or innocence than an individual like a judge or even a panel of experts? How might we prevent some of the potential effects of social conformity that might influence juries? Do you trust the findings of a jury? Well, let me know what you guys all think down in the comments below. I want to give an enormous and eternal thank you to all of my wonderful supporters and backers on Patreon and Subscribestar. You guys are amazing. You allow me to keep making long content like this that is, frankly, pretty spurgy. That being said, if you're not already a supporter, please consider checking out my Patreon or my Subscribestar, or checking out one of the cool new pieces of merch that I have made just for this video, all of which is linked down below in the description. I think the new designs are neat conversation starters, and even if they're not, you can always just tell them that at least the one is lost. Thank you guys so much for watching, and as always, dear friends, Altan of Old.